We interrupt this program to bring you an important Wayfair message. Wayfair's got style tips for every home. This is Styles McKenzie helping you make those rooms sing. Today's style tip. When it comes to making a statement, treat bold patterns like neutrals. Go wild, like an untamed animal print area rug under a rustic farmhouse table from Wayfair.com. Arr, fierce. This has been your Wayfair style tip to keep those interiors superior.
Wayfair, every style, every home.
This is episode 358 of That Shakespeare Life. Just like the work of William Shakespeare, That Shakespeare Life is powered by our patrons. Listeners just like you can access bonus insider history content that coordinates with our show, as well as so many extras. You can find out all the available stuff at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife, and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm Grace Tiffany, author of the new novel Gunpowder Percy. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend, Cassidy Cash.
Writing paper, book paper, paper for illustrations such as woodcuts or engravings. Those kinds of paper were always made of really good quality rags.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Give me the ink and paper, Cleopatra demands in Antony and Cleopatra, Act 1, Scene 5. In Henry IV, Part 1, Peto says, "Nothing but papers, my lord." These are just two of over 100 references to paper in Shakespeare's plays, with characters reading papers, carrying papers, delivering papers, and of course, writing on papers. Naturally, the technology of paper itself isn't that remarkable, being centuries older than Shakespeare. But what is surprising is that in addition to over 100 references to paper, Shakespeare's plays also contain references to parchment, with Hamlet himself asking if parchment was made from sheepskins. There's even a reference in Cymbeline to tablets. These words suggest that paper and parchment were common for Shakespeare's lifetime, but as far as paper-like material goes, there's also canvas that some of the most famous 16th and 17th century paintings were prepared upon, along with vellum, linen, and even wax tablets. With all of these options for what to write on, I wanted to learn more about how paper was made, what it was made from, whether Hamlet was right about parchment and sheepskins, and to know which of these options was most popular and why. That's why we're delighted to welcome Cathy Baker to the show today to help us explore the history of paper, vellum, and canvas from Shakespeare's lifetime. Dr. Kathleen Baker began her career as a paper conservator at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London before returning to the U.S. to teach paper conservation at the University of New York. She's the author of numerous articles and books about paper conservation, including the award-winning From the Hand to the Machine, 19th Century American Paper and Mediums, Technologies, Materials, and Conservation. She holds an MA in Art History with a minor in Book Arts from Syracuse University and an MFA in Book Arts and a PhD in Communication Studies, both from the University of Alabama. Roll Tide. In 2005, she joined the conservation department at the University of Michigan Library, where she was paper and book conservator and later conservation exhibition coordinator. Upon her retirement in 2016, she was honored with the title Conservation Librarian Emerita. Since retiring officially, she has been concentrating on two projects: her successful publishing business, the Legacy Press, which issues books about the printing, paper, and bookbinding arts, notably the successful series Suave Mechanicals, and her research project into how the first Western-made wove paper that appeared in John Baskerville's 1757 Virgil was made. If you'd like to learn more about Kathleen Baker and her work in paper conservation, be sure to check the show notes today for more details. While you're listening to the show today, if you would like to look at some visuals of the history we're going to be talking about, including woodcut illustrations, museum artifacts, and primary documents that Cathy is going to talk about, you can see some of the visuals by logging into our detailed show notes. These are available at cassidycash.com/episode 358. That's the show notes for today. And if you'll click on the detailed show notes button, you can log in as a patron to expand all of these extras while you listen to the show. And now let's dive into the history. Hello, Cathy. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, Cassidy. Nice to be here.
What was the predominant material for paper in the 16th and 17th century?
In a word, rags. If the paper was meant for objects that were to last, such as writing paper, book paper, paper for illustrations, such as woodcuts or engravings, those kinds of paper were always made of really good quality rags. How a rag becomes good quality, after all, it is a rag. Still, these objects, once they've worn out, do have their use. And so, particularly finely woven linen or hempen meaning coming from the hemp plant, clothes or household textiles such as sheets or tablecloths and handkerchiefs were converted into paper. For more ephemeral objects, such as, for example, wrapping paper, very poor quality rags were used, possibly with the addition of fiber from ropes or burlap bags or other kinds of woven or non-woven fibers like that.
I didn't realize that they had wrapping paper in Shakespeare's lifetime. Would they have actually wrapped, I'm assuming, for gifts or maybe even around meat, or what was the wrapping paper used for?
Yes, generally for wrapping groceries. I think wrapping sugar was maybe a little bit too early for this time period, but there was actually something called sugar paper, which was actually blue. But it could be used for other sorts of uses. A good quality brown paper, really strong, could be used possibly for some sort of housing construction use. It's just that every single available source of fiber was used for paper eventually, not particularly in England at this time period, because paper making in England only started in the very late 15th century. So we're only talking 100 years before Shakespeare's time.
Did paper in the 16th century have a standard shape or some kind of set dimension? I know here in the US, the standard writing paper size is 8.5 by 11, and I believe it's A4 in the UK. But I'm assuming there wasn't a standardization for Shakespeare's lifetime.
Oh, no. There absolutely was.
Oh, fantastic.
Practically all paper made in the West was based originally on the sizes of books, the few books that could be made from animal skin, where the leaves of the books or the pages of the books were made from animal skin. Animal skin is obviously a very finite size. And so the people who prepared parchment for manuscripts would lay out an animal skin and decide how many leaves or folded folios they could get out of that skin. Because that manuscript tradition was so long, over 1,000 years before paper, then it was very natural for people making paper to simply adopt those same sizes and those same shapes. Things actually haven't changed very much. If you look at the sizes of paper over the long period of time, they remain within a few inches of one another, even to this day.
So what size paper would Shakespeare have used if he was writing?
Well, that's a good question. It depends on the use. If he was writing scripts for his plays, then he would have used a standard writing size, which might be a little bit different from more or less the same kind of paper, but made for books. So the writing paper and book paper generally had slightly different dimensions, but usually only within an inch or an inch and a half of one another in one or other dimension. Generally, paper was made for books, and then depending on how you folded that sheet, whether one fold would be a folio, two folds would be a quarto, three folds would be an octavo. This is getting into the weeds a little bit, but you could take one sheet of paper, fold it in half, and then either tear it down that fold and make 2 sheets of writing paper, for example, or you could cut the paper and make 2 sheets of writing paper. So writing paper was generally a portion of a standard size or nearly a standard size sheet of paper. And then the full sheet could also be folded down into, well, for books.
What was the manufacturing process for creating paper?
Well, if we just look at rags, first the rags were collected and then they were sorted by color or fineness of weave, the amount of wear, the amount of staining, and that sort of thing into different grades. The grades represented raw material that would be used for different kinds of paper, which had different uses: writing paper, wrapping paper, book paper, plate paper. The finest grade of rags were then torn or cut into small pieces and set aside in a pile to ferment in a process called retting, retting. And this essentially broke down the woven structure of the cloth. It softened the material. It cleaned the rags of things like grease and all the other things that could be associated with rags, which we won't go into, and make that material, those fermented rags, into a pulp. Once the retting was complete, the rags were put into a stamper, which is a kind of mechanized masher. And after a long time of stamping and continuously rinsing with water, the rags were completely broken down into individual fibers. And these fibers were only a couple of millimeters long, if that long. So by the time the pulp came out of the stamper, it was generally much whiter than it was when the rags went into the stamper in the first place. The problem with the stamper was that it took a great deal of time, sometimes many, many days, for the retted cloth to be reduced to pulp. In the late 1600s, well after Shakespeare's death, a machine called a Hollander beater was invented in the Netherlands. And this machine dramatically reduced the amount of time and energy that was needed to reduce the rags to pulp. That pulp was then put into a large vat along with a lot of water. And from it, a man called a vat man formed the sheets of paper on hand molds. And these were eventually pressed and dried into sheets. Of course, the process is much more complicated than that, but hopefully you get the picture.
Did everyone make their own paper when they needed it, or was paper commercially available? I think about Shakespeare in particular. Would he have bought his paper to write his plays on, or would he have had to make it there at home?
Oh, no. He could never have made paper by himself. The process that I explained means you have to have access to a very, very large space and a very particular kind of building construction, because there's a lot of water involved. Usually power has to be generated from a water wheel. You have to have specialized equipment such as stampers. You have to have vats. You have to have very, very large presses. You have to have a loft to dry the paper. It was just simply not practical at all for any particular individual to make their own paper. He would have to have bought his paper probably from a stationer, and that paper could have been made in England, although good quality papers made in England at that time were not available. So it is far more probable that he bought imported paper either from France or from Holland. And the same thing would have been true for the printer who printed his folios, his plays. They probably also bought paper from either Holland or France. In fact, I think the first folio paper came from France.
What makes 16th century paper unique from modern day printer paper, for example? Explain for us what the differences might be.
The actual biggest difference between 16th century and 21st century paper is the source of fiber. As I've already explained, the fiber source for most really good quality papers was rags. But if you're talking about ordinary copy paper, for example, that we're all very familiar with, all of the fiber for that paper came from trees. So we have two very, very, very different sources of different kinds of plants. The linen rags come from the flax plant, which is a bast fiber. And our modern paper, most of it comes from trees, either hardwood trees or softwood trees. Except for the differences in processing rags and then processing the fiber from trees. Those can be very, very different. From the beater stage or the stamping stage on, all papers share common techniques for the formation of sheets. Although in the 16th century, of course, all paper was made by hand. And starting in the 19th century, the machine, actually two kinds of machines, gradually took over from hand paper making.
So in Hamlet, he talks about parchment being made from sheepskins, and I want to explore whether he's correct in this or not. I mean, you mentioned earlier that it could have been made from animal skins, but what's the difference between paper, vellum, and parchment, and would sheepskins have been used to make parchment?
So paper is always made from a vegetable fiber. Animal skin, from which parchment and vellum is made of protein fibers. The vegetable fibers that we're talking about for rag paper is, as I said before, flax or hemp. And for example, fibers from wool or silk, both of which are proteinaceous fibers, cannot be made into paper, nor can synthetic fibers such as polyester, because chemically these materials, these fibers cannot bond with each other in the same way that vegetable fibers can to create a cohesive, durable sheet. Parchment is completely different from paper in that it's made from an animal skin, goat and sheep being the most common. But actually, parchment can be made from any kind of animal, including deer. Parchment really refers to a process rather than the raw material that's used. So as long as we have an animal skin, you can use the process of converting it into parchment on any kind of animal that you have at hand. Most of us, when we think of using an animal skin, we think of using a tanned skin. And that leather, which is called leather rather than parchment, is usually some shade of brown, is quite soft, supple, pliable, relatively thick, and very, very durable. Parchment, on the other hand, is a process that yields a skin which is white or slightly yellow, depending on which side of the parchment you're looking at. And it is thinner and stiffer than tanned leather because it will be used as a writing or a printing surface rather than something that's going to cover your feet. Vellum is a kind of parchment. It's a very fine, thin sheet of parchment. And usually this fineness is due to the young age of the animal. And yes, parchment is made from sheep. So he was absolutely correct.
Thank you for that, Hamlet. So what's the difference between a paper that a script might have been written on and the canvas that an artist might have used for a painting? Is that another application of parchment, or was that just paper that was stretched across a frame?
No. A canvas is a woven material. It's a very not necessarily coarsely woven, but a very heavy-duty thread that is woven into a cloth. But this cloth is really relatively thick and quite stout. And it is primed by coating the surface, one side of the surface. Once this cloth is stretched over a wooden frame, you have to prime the surface of the canvas because you can't just paint on plain canvas. The paint you'll be able to see the texture of the weave. The paint will go sucked into the canvas. You need to be able to apply the paint on a smooth white, usually white surface, which is, I think, trying to remember back in my painting days, it's a material called gesso, which I believe is calcium sulfate with a binder, generally glue. And that is coated on the canvas in several coats to completely remove any evidence that the canvas is still there. This would be completely inappropriate for writing a script on or printing because it is way too thick for a start and extremely expensive. It takes a lot longer to weave a cloth than it does to make a sheet of paper, although it probably takes more time to prepare a piece of parchment than either one of those two things.
So most of Shakespeare's plays would have, like, if he were just sitting down to write them, he would have been using some of the paper that you've described, and probably
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, what are the preservation techniques for these kinds of sheets of paper and letters, but also books and manuscripts? I mean, all the materials that you're talking about here, from the vegetable fiber to the animal protein, are compostable. They degrade over time. So what does it look like to keep them surviving?
I want to say right here that people think of paper as being very vulnerable. It is an incredibly durable, permanent material, given its thickness. You have to do a lot to paper to actually get it to disintegrate entirely. And I'm not even sure that's possible unless you burn it. I mean, after all, paper survived the Titanic. So you can expect a lot out of paper, but of course, we all want to preserve the things that mean the most to us. So the preservation requirements for anything made out of paper is basically the same. The most important thing is to keep paper dry. And this is to avoid water staining and, more importantly, mold from growing on the paper when it's wet. Books are quite well protected by their bindings, which may suffer from a water event, but the binding often keeps the paper inside from being badly damaged. Loose sheets of paper, however, such as letters, drawings, and other documents, rarely have the protection afforded by a binding. And so it's very important to keep these kinds of materials in boxes or drawers and stored off the floor on shelves. Other kinds of problems come from too much exposure to light, and that is any light, over long periods of time. Though the paper in Shakespeare's time was much less affected by light compared to 20th century newspapers, for example, which can become very brown and brittle after just a few days exposure to sunlight. Now, however, even common copy paper made from carefully processed wood fibers is manufactured in such a way that it rivals handmade paper made from fine rags in terms of its preservation. High temperatures and humidity levels are also problematic because these speed up any adverse chemical reaction that may be occurring in the paper. So if you take these fairly simple precautions, you can expect materials made on paper to last for a long time. Parchment, when paper was first introduced into the West, it was seen as a very non-permanent material. People preferred parchment, thinking that it was much more durable. In fact, parchment is far more susceptible, particularly to high and very low humidity, than paper is. And so people eventually realized that this was the case, and generally parchment was phased out in the use of, and paper was so much cheaper than parchment. Parchment was reserved for only very special occasions.
Well, I know that there's a lot to unpack here, as you alluded to when you said that just answering one of the questions about the difference between paper and vellum and parchment will require several lectures to cover completely. We're excited to dive into some of that history. Can you point us towards some recommendations for where we should begin if we're new to this history and we would like to learn more?
Sure. There are a lot of books about the history of paper making, particularly. Most of those, and usually have a little section on parchment because parchment is so closely aligned with paper. But without patting myself too much on the back, I can recommend my book, From the Hand to the Machine, 19th Century American Paper and Mediums, Technologies, Materials, and Conservation, which I published in 2010. And don't get put off by the word American, because really in this book, I cover the typical paper making and printing practices and materials that were in common use in what is referred to as the hand press era, which is basically before 1800 in the West, so for about 700 years, and compares them to the advanced technologies that began to appear in 19th century America before most other countries in the world. In fact, I think before any other countries in the world, as paper making became made by machines. Philip Gaskell's A New Introduction to Bibliography is broader than my book. It covers the trade a lot more than I do. He writes from the perspective of British and European practices and uses English terminology. Dard Hunter, I wrote the biography of Dard Hunter back in 2000. His book, Papermaking, the History and Technique of an Ancient Craft, which is a Dover publication and still available, is the classic reference on this subject. And then lastly, I think Timothy Barrett's book, European Hand Papermaking, Tradition, Tools, and Techniques, published in 2018, is the first edition, presents an overview of the kinds of traditional papermaking that we've been talking about today. But he is an expert on current day hand papermaking techniques using the materials that are available today. Those are probably the major books that I can recommend that will cover the subject very adequately and give any readers the material that they need to find if they have more interest in this.
These are excellent resources, and I encourage you to check out Cathy's book in particular. I'll place links to all of these in the show notes for today's episode. So if you'd like to explore the history of papermaking and printing a little further, you'll have a good foundation to use to begin that study. Stay tuned for the URL for where to find those. Now, Cathy, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
This is a really good question. This is going to sound very odd, I think, but I would like to take with me a copy of my book, From the Hand to the Machine, and if I could have some pencils in addition to that. I have always wanted that book was published 15 years ago, and I have learned so much in the last 15 years that I would love the time and the opportunity to sit down and go through that book sentence by sentence and ask myself, of every sentence, is that actually true? There is so much I have learned, particularly with a project that I have been involved in, that you just because somebody says something, that somebody who you revere, just because they say something doesn't necessarily make it true. And so now I sort of have had questions myself about some of the things that I've written in my book. Is that actually true or not? Is that my experience? Do I agree with that statement in terms of, is that something that I have seen myself that I am perfectly happy about accepting as being the truth? That would give me a huge amount of joy, and hopefully I would be found and I could write another edition of my book.
That's a very industrious use of your time on a deserted island. And I love so much that you are excited enough about your work that you would want to keep it current and revisit what you've wrote in the past. I think that works. And yes, we would let you take some pencils for sure.
Thanks.
So in the vein of future projects, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, as I just mentioned, in 2014, I started on a project to look at a very peculiar paper that appeared in John Baskerville's Virgil, which was published by him in Birmingham in the UK in 1757. It had always been said by paper historians for almost 250 years that this paper was made in a particular way. And I had never actually seen this paper. I had never actually seen the book. And so in 2014, I had the opportunity to see my first copy. It happened to be in the University of Michigan library where I live. And I was struck immediately by the fact that this paper didn't look at all like it had been made in the way that these experts had said. And so I decided to embark on a journey to prove a theory that instead of a woven wire cover or screen on the hand mold upon which paper would have been formed, that instead the paper maker, who was James Watman, actually covered another kind of wire screen with a piece of cloth. And it was on this cloth that the paper was formed, because you could clearly see the woven structure of the cloth in the paper that resulted from that formation. And so I went to the University of Iowa Center for the Book in 2017 and did some paper making experiments. I've made a lot of paper in my past, and made a paper that looks very like the Virgil, what I call the Virgil wove. And I set out to see as many copies of this book as I could. And to date, I have seen 207 copies of this book from all over the world. And I can safely say that the paper that was used in all 207 copies is consistent. And I think that is true over the entire edition, which I believe was between 600 and 700 copies. So I've seen a third of the edition, which is really rare in an 18th edition, the 18th century book, to see so many copies. The problem is with COVID and my other job, which is as the owner, designer, editor of the Legacy Press, which is my publishing house that specializes in books about the printing, paper, and bookbinding arts. I haven't had much time to get back to my Virgil project. And so this year, 2025, I am going to stop publishing new titles. I will continue to reprint popular titles. And of course, my inventory will continue to be sold until that runs out. And I'm making this move so that I can return full time to my early wove paper project in order to write a book. I'm happy to say to anybody out there that the Legacy Press will not be publishing this book. A university press has already expressed interest in publishing it. So I'm very excited to be able to do that.
I can imagine that's an astounding amount of dedication to your theory, and so exciting that the evidence you've uncovered so far supports your premise. I know we'll look forward to seeing that project reach a conclusion and to learn along with you what you uncover as you research into that mystery further. And we wish you the very best with the publication of your book. Thank you so much, Kathleen A. Baker, for being here today and sharing with us the history of paper and paper making for Shakespeare's lifetime. This has been a fun conversation, and I appreciate you being here to share it with us.
It's been a pleasure, Cassidy. Thank you so much.
To learn more about our guest and see links to the resources Cathy mentions for you today, check out the show notes for today's episode. We have links to Cathy Baker's work in rare book conservation and the restoration of paper artifacts, along with direct links to all of the resources she shared with you today. Find all these things at CassidyCash.com/episode 358. That's CassidyCash.com/EP358. If you love the history you learn about here on the show and you'd like to go one step further to actually try out some of the history we talk about here on the podcast, then you're going to love my DIY history kits. This week, I have an actual activity you can do that lets you try out how to make writing paper from spare linen. We follow the same process that would have been done in the 16th and 17th century, and you can complete this at home with items you probably already have in your home or can easily find at your local market or store. You can purchase this activity right now at CassidyCash.com/thatshakespeareshop, or you can sign up for Experience Shakespeare on Patreon to get access to this kit and all of our collection of activity kits that's available inside the Patrons Library. Find that at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.